Each week, I go through all of the matchups for the upcoming week, put the teams side by side on my Phil Steele Plus, and then write down some interesting notes as I go through it. So I'm going to share those with you every Wednesday. They're called my News and Notes from Wednesday, and let's get rolling. And by the way, don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel. Keep it free all season long. Make sure you hit the bell, give us a like, and also let me know what you'd like to see on Wednesday. If there's something you'd like to see specifically on Wednesday, go ahead, leave me a note down below. See if we could squeeze it in. First of all, if you're looking for a fantasy football player this week, all right, I'm going to go to the SEC. I'm going to click on Missouri, and they're taking on Troy this weekend. Now, here is why my fantasy football player of the week will be Kellie Bryant of Missouri. First of all, let's click on Troy, get them lined up over here. Let's look at Troy's defense. They played Southern Miss, pretty average offense. Gave up 738 yards. They played Arkansas State. Arkansas State had lost their quarterback, so they had a first-time starting quarterback last week, and 558 yards, 455 yards passing, 626 yards passing. Now, this is Missouri, and if Missouri's got a reputation, it would be during the Drew Lock era that he put up enormous stats against weak competition. I won't go through all 3 years for you, but I will go through a couple. Here's Drew Lock at the top. As you see, struggled against South Carolina, struggled against Purdue, struggled against Auburn. Kentucky, 355 yards. Struggled against Georgia, 467 against Idaho, 377 against Connecticut. Struggle. Vanderbilt had a decent game. Arkansas, 448. And, of course, Missouri State in the opener, 521 yards. I go back, same thing with 2018. Big games against the weaker foes, 398 yards against Wyoming, 375 Purdue, and then struggled Memphis, 350 yards. So as you see, Missouri puts it on weaker foes. Kellie Bryant's having a good year. He's got an 8-3 ratio. Not a great year, but a good year. I'm looking for him to have his best game. And already here, as you see, 423 yards against Wyoming, week 2. So my fantasy football player of the week is going to be Kellie Bryant of Missouri. Missouri puts it on weaker opponents. Kellie Bryant's looking for a big breakout game, much like he had against Wyoming. Troy's defense against not great quarterbacks has already had 2 games giving up 626 and 425. You know, one thing I pointed out last week with Florida Atlantic, it might have been an inside the press box, is at the end of the season, they lost to Charlotte. That was loss number 7, kept them out of a bowl game. Well, last week, Florida Atlantic bounced back, got the revenge. Look at that, a 557, 336-yard edge on the road. Won the game 45-27. Interestingly, there's another team in somewhat the same situation this week. This could be our deja vu section for the week. And we're going to take a look at SMU. SMU last year, if you look at their season, I love how it's color-coded green and red. You can tell wins and losses. They had 6 losses going to week 7 against Tulsa. If they win this game, they get to a bowl game. They lost. It was a tight game. They lost 27-24. SMU did score with 1:31 left to get within 3, but couldn't get any closer, and that knocked them out of a bowl. Well, this week they're playing Tulsa, and this has been a SMU team on a roll. Look at this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And here's something interesting. SMU is a perfect 5-0 against the spread. And here's a fact for you, and I put this out on Twitter earlier this week, and my Twitter is @PhilSteele042. There are 18 unbeaten teams in college football right now. 18. How many teams are unbeaten against the spread? Well, it's a little more difficult to go unbeaten against the spread. There are only 4 teams in college football that have not lost against the spread. Who are they? Well, one of them is SMU. SMU is a perfect 5-0 against the spread, beating Arkansas State on the road, destroying North Texas, destroying Texas State, upsetting TCU, and then in a letdown spot last week against South Florida on the road, traveling after upsetting TCU. No problem. And I love the half times here on Phil Steele Plus. Look at this, 34-0 at the half, 364 96-yard edge. You look at that 48-21 final, you think it was a somewhat semi-close game? No, it wasn't. 34-0. I think they even made it 41-0 in the second half. Yeah, look at that. 41-0 with 2 minutes and 30 seconds left in the third quarter. USF would get 1, 2, 3 touchdowns late in that game. SMU totally dominant. So this is an SMU team that brought in a lot of Power 5 transfers, including Shane Buechele, their quarterback, hitting 69% with a 10-5 ratio. Reggie Roberson from Cal, leading receiver. He's got 510 yards. So they are a team that's doing great spread-wise this year. Open that up a little bit so we can see everything. Look at their average game grade. They are number 17 in the country, playing to an average game grade of 102.1. And Tulsa's a team that kept them from going to a bowl last year. We'll see if that deja vu happens again. You know, a couple of things surprised me. Coming into the season, it was a given that Minnesota would have a good rush attack. Why? They have perhaps the largest offensive line in college football. Last year, down the stretch, they really got rolling. Ibrahim, who's a 1,000-yard rusher, is back this year. Rodney Smith, who rushed for 977 here, he's back this year. Smith rushed for 1,000 here. Shannon Brooks, he's back this year. They've got a bevy of running backs. They've got a big offensive line. These numbers surprise me. Look at this. They're averaging 2.6 yards per carry. Their last 2 games, they rushed for 93 and 92 yards. The star's been Tanner Morgan, their quarterback. Last week, he had 21 of 22, a Big Ten record, by the way, 21 of 22 for a completion percentage attempts over 15. So Minnesota, surprising with that big O-line and a bevy of running backs, struggling to run the football. Be interesting to see how that plays out once they get into some real competition. But they've got a pretty soft slate this year, perhaps the softest slate in the Big Ten all year. Illinois this week, Nebraska at Rutgers, Maryland. Beefs up here. They're going to play Penn State, Iowa, Northwestern, Wisconsin defenses in the month of November. It'll be interesting to see how that shakes out. But to me, that surprised me that Minnesota is not running the football after running it so well down the stretch last year. Another team that has really changed its MO this year. Let's go to the MAC and take a look at Northern Illinois. Now, Northern, if you look here, has always had a solid run game, a good run defense. They allow 2.7 yards per carry, and they get a lot of sacks, 50 sacks. Here they had 43 sacks. They allowed 3 yards per carry, and they ran the football well. Here they ran the football well, 240 yards per game, 5.2. This was an off year. Look at all the losses they had. So they actually struggled on the rush defense and the sacks. That was an off year for Northern. They normally do better. How they doing this year? Those are the categories that are all their weak spots. Struggling to run the football, 2.8 yards per carry. Now, granted, they have played Utah, Nebraska, Vanderbilt, 3 Power 5 teams back to back to back. But still, those numbers, very surprising. 85 yards per game rush, 2.8 yards per carry. And look at a run defense, a strength for years. 5.4 yards per carry they're giving up. And how about the sacks? 3 sacks all season in 4 games. So what used to be their strength, they went 50 sacks last year, allowed just 2.7. This year they have 3 sacks. They're allowing 5.4, and they're struggling to run the football. A big change in MO. They're throwing the football now. They've actually only run the ball 123 times, thrown it 145. Last year they ran the ball 597 times, threw it 401. See what the previous year was. Ran at 558, threw at 405. So change in the offense to go into more of a passing team, change into rush defense and not getting the sacks. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out this year. But I found that interesting because you just assume Northern Illinois has got a strong rush attack, a strong rush defense, and they're going to get to the quarterback. You know, last week was an unusual week for quarterback running back injuries. Sometimes you lose a quarterback. Sometimes you lose a star running back. 3 teams last week lost both of them. Now, Arizona was interesting because it wasn't expected, but Khalil Tate and J.J. Taylor both missed the game with injury. They were late scratches. So who took over? It was Grant Gunnell took over. He had 25 of 44. He's more of a pocket passer. He's not the running threat that Tate is. In fact, as you see here, 6 carries, 0 yards. So the pocket passer, Grant Gunnell, hit 29 of 44. Without Taylor, they struggled a little bit in the run game. Taylor hasn't had a huge year, but did have 102 yards against Northern Arizona. He was out. You take away Tate, you take away Taylor's running ability, and all of a sudden you look at Arizona's rush offense, and they went from 431 to 314 down to just 99 yards. Now, they still managed to get the win against UCLA at home, and Tate could return this week. Taylor could return this week. I'll update you on Twitter as the week goes on, whether they'll be back or not. It was good to get Gunnell in the lineup, but it was highly surprising to see both a quarterback and a running back scratch before the game. And then there were 2 games last week where the team lost its starting quarterback. And in Purdue's case, it wasn't their starting running back, but that didn't matter. They hadn't been running the football. It was their All-American wide receiver. They lost Elijah Sindelar and their All-American wide receiver, Rondale Moore. You know what else is interesting? They lost him on the same play in the first quarter. So it was a ball game against Minnesota. I believe it was 7-7 if we go back and take a look. 7-3, no, it was 7-3, 14-10 at one point. But Purdue loses their starting quarterback, Sindelar, who had thrown, by the way, if you look at the passing stats, Sindelar in the first game, 423, 509. He missed the TCU game, but he was going to be back from Minnesota, so you had to expect big production. And then Rondale Moore is a guy that is an All-American, 124, 220. Look at that. Moore goes out after just 2 catches for 18 yards. They lose Sindelar, they lose Moore, and they lost him on the same play of the game. Very interesting. And another team that had some problems, I pointed out last week that inside the press box with UNLV, that whenever Armani Rogers started a game and finished a game, I believe UNLV was 13-3 against the spread, and they were going against Wyoming. Part of the reason I liked them against Wyoming, well, in the second quarter last week, and we'll take a look at this game as well, the score is UNLV 10-7. They're beating Wyoming after one quarter. In the second quarter, out of the game goes Armani Rogers, which is big because that's UNLV football right there. They don't cover when they don't have them. Kenyon Oblad came in the rest of the game. But not only did they lose Rogers, they lost their star running back, Charles Williams. Williams came in averaging 8.6 yards per carry, injured second quarter. So they lose those 2 guys. Offense goes out the window for UNLV, and all of a sudden they lose 53-17 to Wyoming. So it was interesting to see. Highly unusual to see 2 star offensive players go out in the same game. Those are 3 games last week that it all happened in, so I thought I'd point that out. If you want to know how to stop the Wisconsin Badgers, my suggestion would be turn on the tape of the Northwestern games. And this was pointed out to me in a couple of radio shows I did last week. Folks asked, can Northwestern stop Wisconsin? And you still thought, no, I don't know if they necessarily can, but look how Wisconsin's done against Northwestern. Wisconsin had just 323 yards here. They had the 11th best performance against Northwestern all year. Northwestern plays a lot of teams. It's 13 games a year. Wisconsin had the number 11 performance against Northwestern. Against Northwestern here, 306 yards. Look at all this green. 306 yards, 13 first downs against Northwestern. Once again, number 11 performance against Northwestern all year. Here's Northwestern, 333 yards. Once again, a lot of green in here. And you look at Northwestern, the number 11 performance against Northwestern. So Northwestern's one of their best performances all year for their team and one of the worst performances for Wisconsin. Here's 203 yards against Northwestern, 126. So if I'm a defensive coordinator, I'm going to turn on the film and see what Northwestern's doing against Wisconsin, because Jonathan Taylor's not gaining a lot of yards. Wisconsin's not gaining a lot of yards. In fact, last week, this stat's interesting. Wisconsin's defense scored 2 touchdowns. They outscored both the Wisconsin offense and the Northwestern offense. Those two, Wisconsin's offense put together 1 touchdown. Northwestern got 2 late scores. That thing was actually, and if you click on these box scores, I like this because you can see how the game was. It was 24-3 in the fourth quarter. Northwestern got 2 late touchdowns, but Northwestern's offense had 2 touchdowns late. But Wisconsin's defense, and we'll go back to this box score once again. If you look at their scores, they had the fumble return for a touchdown here and a 68-yard interception return for a touchdown. Were big factors in that game. So I find that interesting. And if I'm a defense coordinator, I'm going to take a look and see what Northwestern's schemes are against Wisconsin. I'm going to put them in. All right, let's keep rolling here. You go back to Purdue last week, and something I want to point out about them. What did Purdue gain notoriety for recently? Well, it was their upset of Ohio State. Not just their upset of Ohio State, but their beatdown of Ohio State at home, 49-20. There was nothing fluky about it. They led big throughout, even put on a couple of scores late. Ohio State pulled within 35-20. Purdue added 2 more scores to make the final 49-20. Since then, they've played 10 games. Purdue is 2-8 against the spread. So this game here got them a lot of notoriety. They have struggled. They lost to Michigan State the next week. They did get past Iowa, got blown out by Minnesota, lost in 3 overtimes at Wisconsin. They got past Indiana and then got blown out by Auburn. And this year, it's pretty much been disappointment, other than the Vanderbilt game, which they won at home. Now, granted, last week they lost their quarterback and star wide receiver, and here they didn't have their quarterback against TCU, but 2-8 against the spread. And I bring that up because a team I'm going to compare them to potentially might just be this Georgia State. You know, Georgia State looked great when they beat Tennessee here in this game at the start of the year, and you're thinking, wow, this could be a very good Georgia State team. And they struggled against Furman, got blown out by Western Michigan, and last week they played a good game. They had a 423, 350-yard edge, 27-20 first down edge, but really you should be able to beat Texas State on the road. They lost by 3 on the road. So since that win against Tennessee, they have failed to cover against the spread, and we'll see if that one continues on. They had a bye last week, and now this week they host Arkansas State. A lot of notoriety for that Tennessee win. We'll see what happens after that. Take a look at another team where it's just played very true to form the last 2 years, and that's the Maryland Terrapins. Maryland does great when they take on a weak or an average rush defense. They struggle against strong rush defenses. Take a look at Temple last year. Temple held them to 132 yards. Temple won. Michigan held them to 147 yards. Michigan won. You look at the Greens, wins. Iowa, good run D, 68 yards rushing, shut out. Michigan State, best run D in the country, 26 yards rushing, 3 points, loss. Indiana, Ohio State did not have a good run defense last year. They did not, and Maryland ran all over them. Penn State, good run D, 74 yards, 3 points. So they struggle when they take a good run D on, and they lose. When they don't take on a good run D, or they just take on an average run D, they do well. So far this year, Howard, good. Syracuse, average run D, got them. Temple, good run D, beat them. Penn State, good run D, beat them. This week, Rutgers. All right, I'm going to take a look at Rutgers, see how they do against run defense. And click on Rutgers. Rutgers, of course, just fired their coach. They're giving up 4.6 yards per carry, 198. I would have to think this week, good game for Maryland. And all of a sudden, Anthony McFarland looks like the star he was in the first couple of weeks. With the better run game, Josh Jackson will probably look better. And if we go back to Josh Jackson when he was at Virginia Tech, and click on that 2 years ago, 2017. Let's click on individual player stats. At the start of the year, Josh Jackson got off to a great start. Look at all these numbers. 235, 223, 373, 298, 251, 322. Then comes the meat of the ACC schedule. And the numbers drop off, 132, 200, but less than 50% completions, 197, 153, 218, once again, 17 to 37, 143 yards passing. And in the bowl game, he did throw for 248, but barely 50%. So a big difference against the better opponents, against the weaker opponents early on. He had good success. So I think you might see the same thing out of Josh Jackson this year against strong defenses. Might struggle a little bit. We'll have to see how that plays out. But not playing a strong defense this week. Rutgers giving up 413 yards per game, and that includes just giving up 307 to UMass. So they're a team that I think Maryland can have success against. All right, we're going to wrap up Wednesday news and notes. And don't forget to hit subscribe. Well, we're going to give you 3 toughest schedule plays. Now, these are 3 teams that have taken on top 20 schedules, that are taking on teams that have faced bottom 20 schedules, and therefore the team that faced the bottom 20 schedule might be a little overrated, and these teams that all face pretty tough schedules might be a little underrated. So let's start with Georgia Southern against South Alabama this week. Georgia Southern has played LSU. They played an undefeated Minnesota, and they played that Louisiana team that is undefeated against the spread this year. I pointed out last week, remember I said the magic number is 227 in that game? If Louisiana rushes for over 227, they'll win. Well, Louisiana ran for 275 against them. So this is a Georgia Southern team that's played a pretty tough schedule, walks into this thing 1-3, and South Alabama comes in 1-4, but they've done it against a fairly weak schedule. They have played Nebraska, Memphis, UAB, 3 decent teams, but also Jackson State, ULM, and they walk into this thing just 1-4. Strength of schedule says Georgia Southern this week going on the road. So the strength of schedule play would be Georgia Southern. By the way, last year against South Alabama, look at this, 48-13, just dominated the game. See if we can get a quick thing of the yards. They ran for 295 yards in the game. Toughest schedule play here would be Georgia Southern over South Alabama. Let's take a look at another interesting one. New Mexico State against Liberty. And New Mexico State, we'll click on them here. We'll click on Liberty over here. New Mexico State opened up with Washington State, Alabama, San Diego State, who I feel is one of the top Mountain West teams, at New Mexico, and home against Fresno. They were in the Mountain West title game last year. That's a pretty rough slate. And as you would expect, 0-5. Against the weakest foe they faced, New Mexico, they only lost by 3, and that was on the road. Now they get Liberty at home, and last year, these guys play a home-and-home series. They beat Liberty at home. On the road, they lost to Liberty. I believe they covered both games, however, but the home team won both. Now you look at Liberty. Liberty's played Syracuse, Louisiana, Buffalo, Hampton, and New Mexico. Washington State, Alabama, San Diego State, Fresno. All 4 of these teams are above anybody they've played. Maybe Syracuse could be in that category. The rest of them, no. Very soft schedule for Liberty. They got past that same New Mexico team by 7 at home last week. This week, Liberty's over a touchdown favorite on the road. So I've got New Mexico State playing the 11th toughest schedule. I've got Liberty playing the 121st toughest schedule. So a schedule play is going to be New Mexico State plus the points over Liberty. And the final one we're going to take a look at is a marquee matchup on Friday. It is Cincinnati and UCF. We'll put the visitor on the left here. I love this Phil Steele site, by the way. And because it is what I use. I love the green, the red. It's just really, really nice to have. We'll take a look at Cincinnati. Now, Cincinnati had an abysmal game against Ohio State, but guess what? Every opponent Ohio State has played an abysmal game. In fact, if you look at my average game grades, which I put up here on and I'll tweet it out again today. So go to Phil Steele Twitter, and I'll tweet that out. Also, I want to show you one thing. I'm going to get off track here for a minute. Let's look at this game. Let's go back at the Michigan State-Indiana finish. Now, it's tie game. There's 6 seconds left. Michigan State gets a field goal to win by 3, and they're happy. Look at that. Then Indiana does the lateral play. You see it right here? Throws it back. No time left on the clock, by the way. 0. Picks it up, falls on it in the end zone, touchdown. Guess what? Easy win for Michigan State, right? They win this thing 40-31 and win by 9. That would be a misleading final. Michigan State needed this field goal in regulation to get there. Let's see if I even have it up here. And by the way, is that it right there? There you go. My average game grades only look at this year's performance, yards, points, and opponent. Now, how these numbers work out here is they take account not just the score of the game, but the offensive yards, rushing and passing, the defensive yards, rushing and passing, and then the opponent. Now, as you see, these are pretty remarkable numbers. You're outgaining an opponent by 598 yards, and yet it's not even as good a grade as they had against FAU, where they only outgained FAU by 260 yards because FAU's a stronger opponent, and that earned a better game grade than it did beating Florida A&M by a far more margin. So the average game grade takes into account the strength of opponent, and if you click here on Twitter, at PhilSteele042, Ohio State's number 1. And it says no preseason rating on Ohio State. No preseason rating on Oklahoma, Alabama, Wisconsin. It's just what they've done so far this year. They are the number 1 team in the country right now. Oklahoma's number 2 at 117.84. Alabama, number 3, 117.8. Wisconsin, which was number 1 heading into last week, but didn't have such a good game. Let's go take a look at that Northwestern game last week and why they dropped from number 1 to number 4. And remember, it counts all 4 games in. Let's see where we got the opponent game grade. I don't have it all on here. There we go. That was only a 92.6 game grade. Why? They only had 243 yards offense against Northwestern last week. Against 255, they actually got outgained in the game. That right there took what was a great game grade and dropped it down. So it's an average of the entire season. You may have one great game, like LSU beating Texas. Great game. But it's all the games on the season. So number 5, Auburn, And Auburn's deserved to be up there. They're at 111.1. They've played some outstanding games. Clemson, undefeated and number one in the polls until this past week where they dropped to number 2. So far this year, they're playing at number 6. And everybody's looking at last week's game where, they struggled against North Carolina. Let's go click on the Clemson for a second. They struggled against North Carolina. They still actually had a slight yardage edge and beat them on the road, but it wasn't a great game. But they've played pretty good this year, 52-14. Texas A&M, remember, they led 24-3. And right here, they gave up a touchdown with 6 seconds left in the game. I want to point that out. Syracuse, they beat 41-6 on the road. Charlotte, 52-10. And in that game, they played 110 players, as I pointed out last week, or 111 players. Every walk-on even got on the field in that game, and they still won 52-10, actually still covered. So as close as this was last week, and as much as everybody's saying, hey, they're struggling, they didn't really struggle these first 4 games. And they did beat North Carolina on the road. Everybody's entitled to one bad game. Trevor Lawrence, I did point out last week, though, actually had a lower QBR than did Sam Howell for North Carolina. As you remember, I pointed that out. Well, Trevor Lawrence, still 8 touchdown passes, 5 interceptions. Last year, Trevor Lawrence, 30 touchdowns, 4 interceptions. He needs to get it rolling. They've got Florida State at Louisville, Boston College. They've got some games which could be potentially there. But for everybody who's saying, hey, Clemson hasn't really played a good game this year, that's short-term memory. And also the fact they expect Clemson to win every game by 100 points. Like I said, they beat Charlotte playing every single player. They dominated Syracuse on the road. They led A&M 24-3. And they destroyed Georgia Tech. So they've had the one bad game this year. Other than that, they just haven't beat everybody 100-0, but they have been doing very well this year. Let's get back now to the game I was talking about, the final strength of schedule play. And we're talking about Central Florida against Cincinnati this week. And when we take a look at Cincinnati, they have played the tougher schedule. They've played UCLA and played a very good game. They had a 199-yard edge against UCLA. They went into Marshall last week. Look at this halftime, 28-0. And in fact, you click on the box, this was 45-0 after 3 quarters. Marshall got a couple of touchdowns in the fourth quarter of the game, but Cincinnati led 45-0. That's a pretty good win because Marshall had been playing well this season. They beat Miami and they played Ohio State. UCF played Florida A&M, FAU, Stanford, which is in a down year, Pittsburgh, which is good. But they're not considered one of the elite teams. They're up there with Ohio State. And then they played Connecticut. So UCF has taken on my number 109 schedule. Cincinnati's taken on my number 12 schedule this year. And average game grade, by the way, has Cincinnati at 102.1, Central Florida at 104.8. This despite the fact Central Florida is outgaining their foes by 244 yards, Cincinnati by 112. Once again, strength of opponent is factored into this. And since he had that one bad game against Ohio State where they were minus 235 yards, but like I said, a lot of teams have had bad games against Ohio State. So your 3 toughest schedule opponents or strength of opponent plays this week are Georgia Southern, New Mexico State, and Cincinnati. Now, I'll be back on Friday with the Phil Steele Plus tour for Friday. I'll have free selections for you once again. Off a couple of poor weeks, but you see we're putting in the work. And last year, these things hit well over 70%. They'll bounce back. We're going to have a big October. And you also get a little in-depth. You get to go inside the games and see what's going on. And I think you'll find it very interesting. So thanks for being with me on my Wednesday update. Oh, I also want to show you this upcoming thing here on Connecticut. And I found this very interesting with the matchup this week for Connecticut and South Florida. And we might have ourselves a very sneaky underplay in this one. So let's get right to that. Now, last week, South Florida and SMU lit up the scoreboard. 69 points on the board, 48-21. Connecticut, they played UCF, and it was 56-21, a 77 points on the board. 2 sorry teams, both 1-3. 2 teams that give up a lot of points, 48 last week, 56. Got to figure the over, right? Well, let's take a little bit closer look at these 2 squads and find out why this one could be a very sneaky underplay this week. Let's first of all look at Connecticut's defense. Now, Connecticut had an abysmal, horrible, awful, miserable defense last year. They gave up 617 yards per game, 335 yards per game on the ground, 7.7 yards per carry. How about 72% completions? They allowed their opponents almost 200 yards per game above what they allowed during the regular season, or what they normally gained during the regular season, which was number 130 in the country. They played a lot of freshmen last year. Those freshmen are now sophomores, and they have shown improvement. Even against UCF this past week, holding them to 607 yards, an improvement over last year. In fact, on the year, Connecticut is holding opponents to 60 yards per game below their season average, a respectable 395 yards per game, 4.8 yards per carry, not great, but also not horrible, and 70% completion. So overall, their defense is much improved over last year. Now let's look at South Florida. They haven't been playing well at all this year. But South Florida's defense has actually held all four opponents below their season yardage this year, allowing just 27 yards per game below what their opponents normally come in allowing. I found that stat very surprising because after watching Wisconsin run through them for 433 yards and scoring at will, I didn't have a lot of respect for their defense, but they actually held Wisconsin to their second lowest total of the year and 10 yards below their season average. Now let's take a look at these two teams' offenses. And here's something interesting. Last week, South Florida played SMU. They trailed that game 41-0. The majority of South Florida's yards and points all came with the game completely out of reach. They put up 240 of their 342 yards once they were down 41-0 in the game. So let's take a look at how they've done against FBS opponents this year. They put up 0 points and 157 yards against Wisconsin. They put up 10 points and 261 yards against Georgia Tech. And they put up in this game against SMU last week 0 points and just 100 yards offense until they were down 41-0. So that's not a very good offense for South Florida. Barnett did come off the bench last week, replacing McLeod, who had replaced him, and Barnett had been struggling prior to that, and looking good in garbage time, Barnett may just win his starting job back. Now let's take a look at Connecticut against FBS foes. Only 285 yards against Illinois, and interestingly, one of their scores against Illinois right here was a 52-yard interception return for a touchdown. So they only had 16 offensive points against Illinois. They had 3 offensive points against Indiana. And against Central Florida last week, they had 0 points until they put up the majority of their yards and points with QB Krakowitz off the bench, down 56-0. They put up 201 of their 426 yards. So right now, USF has scored 10 points and 173 yards per game before that garbage time. And in 3 games, Connecticut has generated 19 offensive points and 217 yards before garbage time. So 2 offenses that are struggling, 2 defenses that are better than you expect. Off the cuff, you have to think high scoring, especially after last week's scores in these 2 games. But what I'm showing you is we've got 2 weak offenses and 2 defenses better than expected. So in a game nobody's probably going to wager on, do you really want to play South Florida? Or do you really want to put your money on Connecticut? You might want to take a look at the under in this game. Let's see how this one works out this week. Hey everyone, this is Phil Steele. If you're a hardcore football fan, make sure you like this video, subscribe, and of course, hit the bell. And comment below your favorite football moment of the week and let us know what you'd like to see here on my YouTube channel.